My name is Jebediah Thorne. Most folks around here just call me Jeb. I'm 67 years old, and I've been a cattle farmer on this same piece of land in the Elkhorn region of Wisconsin my whole life, just like my father and his father before him. I'm not a man given to flights of fancy. My hands are calloused from fixing fences and pulling calves, and my worldview is shaped by the hard, simple truths of the soil. You reap what you sow, you fix what's broken, and you don't waste time on things that aren't real. I've always believed that. I've always prided myself on being grounded, on knowing the difference between a coyote and a feral dog from 1,000 yards, on understanding the language of my cattle just by the way they stand. I'm telling you this so you understand that the man speaking to you now isn't some thrill seeker or a teller of tall tales. I'm a farmer, and what I'm about to share with you goes against every practical, earthbound bone in my body. It's a story I've kept locked up for a year, a secret that's been eating at me like rust on a plow blade. I know how it's going to sound. I know you'll think I'm lonely or old, or that my mind's started to wander. I'd think the same thing if I were you. But I'm sharing it now because the silence out here has gotten heavier, and I feel like people need to know what's walking in the deep woods when the sun goes down. Something is out there, and I lived with a piece of it for 4 years. Before I get into what happened, if you're new here, consider subscribing. I share stories like this regularly. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I always like to know who's listening. All right, let me tell you what happened. It started, as most things do, with a storm. Not just any storm, but one of those violent late spring squalls that rip through the Midwest like God himself is angry. It came in fast and mean, with hail the size of marbles and wind that sounded like a freight train trying to tear the roof off my barn. It was over in an hour, but it left a trail of destruction. The next morning, I went out to check the fence line on the back 40, the section of my property that borders the deep, untamed Kettle Moraine State Forest. It's a wild place, full of glacial ridges and dense woods that can swallow a man whole if he's not careful. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of ozone, snapped pine branches, and damp, black earth. The storm had done a number on the fence. A massive oak, one that was probably a sapling when my great-grandfather first settled this land, had been torn up by the roots and had taken a whole section of barbed wire down with it. As I was surveying the damage, planning the long day of work ahead, I noticed something. The silence. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a dead quiet. No birds chirping their morning songs. No squirrels chattering their outrage from the trees. No rustle of deer in the underbrush. It was the kind of unnatural stillness that tells every animal with an ounce of sense to be on guard. The hair on my arms stood up. I've spent my life in these woods, and that kind of silence is always a preface to something dangerous. That's when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched whimper. It was a sound of pure misery, and it was coming from the base of the fallen oak. It wasn't the yelp of a coyote pup or the cry of a fawn. It was different. My first thought was that some poor creature had been pinned by the tree. I grabbed the heavy-duty axe from my tractor and made my way over, my boots sinking into the soft, rain-soaked ground. The closer I got, the stronger another smell hit me, overriding the clean scent of pine and wet dirt. It was the coppery, metallic stench of blood, a lot of it. And there, tangled in the roots of the oak, was the source. It was a doe, or what was left of one. Her neck was broken, but that's not what killed her. Her entire side was laid open by 3 deep, parallel gashes. I'm no stranger to predator kills. I've seen what bears can do, what wolves and coyotes leave behind. This was none of those. The gouges were too clean, too powerful. It looked like someone had taken a trio of sharpened steel hooks and raked them down the animal's flank with incredible force. Kneeling beside the dead doe, half hidden under a fold of her hide, was the source of the whimpering. At first glance, I thought it was a German Shepherd puppy, maybe a few weeks old. It was covered in mud and its mother's blood, shivering uncontrollably. But as I reached down to pull it out, I saw the things that didn't add up. Its fur was a strange mix of black and gray, coarse like a wolf's. Its paws were too big for its body, disproportionately large, and the front ones had an oddly prominent thumb-like digit. They looked less like paws and more like malformed furry hands. I picked it up. It was light, no more than a few pounds, and it immediately stopped whimpering and tried to burrow into the warmth of my jacket. I looked into its eyes. They weren't the trusting, milky blue of a normal puppy. They were a pale, intelligent gold, and they looked at me with a startling awareness. My gut, the same farmer's intuition that tells me when a cow is about to calf or when a storm is coming, was screaming at me. It was a primal, deep-seated alarm telling me to drop this thing and walk away. Don't get involved. This is wrong. But then I looked at the dead doe, and I looked at this tiny, shivering creature in my arms, an orphan in a world that had just turned violent. My wife, Martha, God rest her soul, she loved all animals. She would have never forgiven me if I'd left it to die. So, against every instinct I had, I zipped up my jacket, cradling the strange pup against my chest, and I took it home. I decided to call him Cain. It felt fitting. He was an outcast from the very beginning. Raising Cain wasn't like raising any dog I'd ever owned. For the first year, he was mostly just a strange, gangly puppy. But the differences were always there, just under the surface. He grew at an astonishing rate. He went from a few pounds to over 100 inside of 6 months, and he didn't stop there. By the time he was 2, he stood a good 3 feet at the shoulder on all fours, with a lean, powerful build that was more wolf than dog. His intelligence was the most unsettling part. He didn't learn tricks, he learned procedures. I only had to show him how to unlatch the gate to the cattle pen once before he could do it himself with a deftness that was frankly unnatural. He'd use his snout and that strange, hand-like front paw to manipulate the bolt. He never barked. Not once. Instead, he communicated with a series of low, guttural sounds. A soft chuff for contentment, a deep rumble in his chest as a warning, and a strange, almost melodic moan when he was watching the sunset from the porch. He seemed to understand complex sentences, not just commands. I'd find myself talking to him like he was a person, explaining my day, my worries about the price of feed or a sick calf. He'd just watch me with those pale, knowing eyes, his head cocked as if he were processing every word. My neighbors, the few I have, just thought he was a big wolf hybrid I'd rescued. I let them think that. How could I explain that my dog could solve simple mechanical problems, or that sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, I'd see him stand up on his hind legs to get a better view over the cornfield? He'd balance there for a few seconds, perfectly still, a tall, dark silhouette against the sky, before dropping back to all fours as if he'd realized his mistake. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself he was just a genetic anomaly, a 1 in a million mutt. A practical man finds practical explanations, and I clung to that one like a drowning man to a log. It was easier than confronting the truth that was growing right in front of my eyes. Despite the strangeness, a bond formed between us, a deep and powerful one. He was my constant shadow, my companion in the lonely quiet of the farm. He was fiercely protective,
No coyote dared come near my chicken coop. He'd run off deer that got into the vegetable garden with a silent, terrifying efficiency. He was good with the cattle, gentle but firm, moving them from pasture to pasture with an instinct that seemed ancient. For 4 years, he was my dog, my friend, my family. I let myself forget where he came from. I let myself believe he was just Cain, my strange, silent protector. I was a fool. The change began subtly, about 6 months before the end. It started with a restlessness.
Cain, who had always been content to stay within the boundaries of the farm, began spending hours at the edge of the woods, staring into the dark tangle of trees. He'd stand there, motionless as a statue, for hours on end, his nose twitching, taking in scents I couldn't perceive. The low, melodic moan he used to make at sunset changed. It became longer, deeper, filled with a sense of longing that made my heart ache. It wasn't a howl, not like a wolf's. It was more complex, like a question being asked to the silent forest. Around the same time, the woods started talking back, in their own way. The unnatural silence I'd experienced the day I found him began to return, but only at night. The chorus of crickets and frogs would just stop, all at once, like a switch had been flipped. The cattle became perpetually spooked. They'd bunch together at night, not in their preferred pasture, but pressed up against the side of the barn, their eyes wide with fear, staring out into the darkness. I started finding tracks along the creek bed at the edge of my property. They were like Cain's, but bigger, much bigger. The stride was longer than any man's, and the impressions they left in the mud were deep, suggesting an immense weight. I told myself it was a bear. We get black bears wandering down from the north woods sometimes, but the tracks weren't right. There were no claw marks where a bear's would be, and the shape of the foot was all wrong. It was long and narrow, more like a man's foot, but ending in distinct canine-like toes. I found a place where one of these things had crossed the fence. The top strand of barbed wire, 5 feet off the ground, had been snapped clean in two. Not pushed down, not climbed over. Snapped. The tension required to do that is immense. No bear could do it. I bought a new box of shells for my .30-06 rifle and started keeping it by the back door instead of in the gun cabinet. I reinforced the locks on the house and the barn. I was acting on pure animal instinct, the same instinct that told my cattle to huddle in fear. My conscious mind was still trying to find a logical explanation. Vandals, maybe, or a local hermit playing tricks. But my subconscious knew better. It knew what was leaving those tracks. Cain himself was changing physically. He'd reached his full growth, and it was terrifying. Standing on his hind legs, which he did more and more often now, he was easily over 7 feet tall. His shoulders had broadened, packed with thick, ropey muscle. The fur on his back and shoulders had darkened to a deep, charcoal black. But the most profound change was in his eyes. The intelligence had always been there, but now it was different. It was sharper, more calculating. The loyal companion was still there, but behind his gaze, something else was looking out. Something ancient, wild, and utterly alien. He was caught between two worlds, and I had the terrible feeling his other world was coming to claim him. The night it all came to a head began with that sound again, the one from the woods. It was a moonless, overcast night in late October. The air was cold and carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when I heard it. A deep, resonant call that echoed through the hills. It was a guttural, booming sound that was part howl, part roar. It wasn't the call of any animal native to North America. It vibrated in my chest, a primal sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the spine.
This time, it wasn't a question. It was a summons. In the living room, Kane shot to his feet from his place by the hearth. Every muscle in his body went rigid. A low, deep growl rumbled in his chest, a sound I had only ever heard him direct at serious threats, like the time a stray bull wandered onto my property. But he wasn't looking toward the door or the windows. He was looking directly at me.
His golden eyes were wide, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in them. The growl wasn't for the thing outside. It was a warning for me. Stay put. Do not go out there. But I'm a farmer. This is my land, my home. The idea of something unknown and threatening calling out from the edge of my property, making my animals terrified and my companion act like this, it filled me with a cold, stubborn anger that overrode my fear. I wasn't about to cower in my own house. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, my voice tight. He just kept growling, a low, constant vibration, his eyes locked on mine. I ignored his warning. I walked to the back door and took my .30-06 from its spot. I grabbed the big 1,000,000 candle power spotlight I keep for checking on the herd at night. Kane whined, a high, desperate sound I'd never heard from him before. It was a plea. I clicked the safety off the rifle and took a deep breath. "Stay," I commanded, my voice betraying a tremor I couldn't control. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit me like a slap. The world was utterly silent. The summons from the woods was not repeated. The air was dead still. Even the leaves on the old maple tree by the porch weren't moving. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting. I switched on the spotlight. The beam, a brilliant white cone, cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the path to the barn, the frost-covered grass, the dark, impenetrable wall of the forest 100 yards away. I walked slowly off the porch, my boots crunching on the stiff grass. Every nerve in my body was screaming. I felt 1,000 unseen eyes on me. The smell hit me then. It wasn't the clean smell of the autumn night. It was a thick, musky odor, a feral stench of wet fur, rot, and something acrid, like old blood. It was the smell of a predator, a big one. I swept the beam of light along the fence line, my heart hammering against my ribs. The beam caught something. A flicker of movement, then a pair of eyes, reflecting the light back at me. They were too high off the ground to be a deer or a coyote. They were at a man's height. I held the light steady, my knuckles white on the grip of the rifle. Slowly, a shape resolved itself from the darkness at the edge of the trees. My brain tried to make sense of it, to fit it into a category I understood. A man in a costume? A bear standing on its hind legs? But it was neither. It was tall, impossibly so, at least a foot taller than me, and powerfully built. It was covered in coarse, matted black fur, with patches of grizzled gray on its chest and muzzle. Its legs were bent at a strange, canine angle, and it stood on 2 feet with an unnerving ease. Its arms were long, ending in those same clawed, hand-like paws I'd seen on Kane as a pup. Only now they were massive and tipped with what looked like thick, yellowed talons. But the head, dear God, the head was the thing of nightmares. It was a monstrous hybrid of man and wolf. It had the elongated snout and powerful jaws of a timber wolf, lined with teeth that were too long, too sharp. But the brow was heavy, like a gorilla's, and set above a pair of deeply intelligent, malevolent eyes. They weren't the reflective, vacant eyes of an animal. They glowed with a dull, hateful red-orange light of their own, and they stared at me with a clear, calculating awareness. This was not a dumb beast. This was a monster that could think. As I stood there, frozen, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing, I swept the light to the left. Another pair of eyes flashed in the darkness. And to the right, a third. They weren't bunched together. They were spread out, a coordinated formation. They were flanking me, using the darkness as cover. The one in the center, the one I had seen first, took a slow, deliberate step out of the tree line. It moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, a predator in its prime. It was the leader. It tilted its head, and a low growl, like rocks grinding together, emanated from its deep chest. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise of violence. My blood ran cold. The rifle in my hands felt like a child's toy. These things weren't just creatures. They were a hunting party. And I was the prey. I was completely, utterly paralyzed. My feet were rooted to the spot. My lungs forgot how to draw breath. My entire life as a practical, grounded man, everything I knew about the world, it all shattered in that single, horrifying moment. The rationalizations, the denials, they were all gone, burned away by the sight of those three impossible figures standing at the edge of my world, ready to tear it apart. All I could do was stare into the face of something that shouldn't exist and wait for it to kill me. That's when Cain moved. He shot out of the open door behind me, a blur of dark fur and focused intent. He didn't bark or snarl. He moved past me, positioning himself directly between me and the creature in the center. He stood his ground, 150 pounds of muscle and loyalty, a stark contrast to the monstrous 7-foot-plus behemoth he was facing. The tension in the air became a physical thing, thick and electric. The leader in the woods straightened to its full height, an imposing, terrifying silhouette. It let out a short, guttural bark, a clear command. The other two creatures began to creep forward from the shadows, their movements low and silent, the way wolves do when they're closing in on a kill. They were going to rush us, overwhelm us. Cain didn't growl at them. He did something far stranger. He let out a series of his own barks and chuffs, sharp and complex. It wasn't the simple communication of a dog. It was a language. He was arguing with them, pleading. The leader took another step forward, its lips curling back to reveal rows of yellowed, dagger-like teeth. It was done talking. It raised its head and let out another booming, command-like roar. The flankers tensed, their muscles coiling like springs, ready to launch themselves forward. In that split second, with death closing in, Cain did the thing that will haunt me until the day I die. He turned his head, just for a moment, and looked back at me. His pale golden eyes, the same eyes I'd looked into when he was a shivering pup, met mine. And in them, I saw an impossible clarity. There was no animal panic, no fear. There was intelligence, understanding, and a heartbreaking choice. He then emitted a sound I had never heard before and will never hear again. It was a single, explosive, guttural syllable. It wasn't a word in any human tongue, but the meaning was as clear as if he had screamed it in perfect English. Run. The spell of my paralysis broke. My survival instinct, buried under a mountain of sheer terror, finally kicked in. I didn't think. I didn't aim the rifle. I just turned and ran. I stumbled on the uneven ground, my legs feeling like lead, my lungs burning. Behind me, the night exploded into a cacophony of sound, the thunderous charge of heavy bodies crashing through the grass, the furious, enraged roar of the leader, a sound of pure hatred and betrayal. And then, a shriek of pain and fury that was not directed at me. It was Cain. He had met their charge. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I slammed into the back door of the farmhouse, fumbling with the knob with hands that shook so violently I could barely control them. I threw myself inside, spun around, and slammed the heavy oak door shut. I threw the deadbolt,
my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I scrambled to the window next to the door, my rifle finally coming up to my shoulder, my cheek pressed against the cold wood of the stock. But it was useless.
The spotlight I'd dropped lay on its side in the yard, its powerful beam now pointing uselessly up into the black, uncaring sky, illuminating nothing but the swirling dust motes in its own light. I was safe inside my house, but I was utterly, terrifyingly blind. I couldn't see a thing, but I could hear everything. The sounds from the yard were the sounds of a brutal, desperate battle. There were deep, savage snarls, the kind that vibrate through the ground. There were high-pitched shrieks of pain and rage. I heard the sickening, heavy thud of bodies colliding with incredible force, the sound of flesh being torn. It wasn't a pack of animals fighting. This was different. It was tactical. It was vicious. And through it all I could distinguish Cain's sounds. His were the defiant roars of a cornered protector, the sounds of a lone warrior holding a pass against an overwhelming force. He was fighting for me. He was buying me time with his own body. The sounds moved, dragging away from the house, back toward the dark tree line. They were driving him back, away from the safety of the light, into their world. The fight seemed to go on for an eternity, each second stretched into a minute of auditory horror. In reality, it was probably less than 2 minutes. The snarling and crashing grew more distant, muffled by the trees. Then there was one final, terrible sound. It was a sharp, piercing yelp of agony that cut through the night and straight into my soul. It was Cain. And then, silence. Not the dead, watchful silence from before. This was an empty silence, a final silence. The battle was over. The crickets didn't start chirping again. The wind didn't stir the leaves. It was as if the world itself had been stunned into submission, ashamed to make a sound after the violence it had just witnessed. I spent the rest of the night with my back pressed against the door, the point 30-06 resting across my knees. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, listening to the profound, absolute nothingness outside. Every creak of the old farmhouse made me jump. Every shadow thrown by the moon peeking through the clouds became one of them, come back to finish the job. Sleep was an impossible luxury. I just waited, my mind a churning mess of terror, grief, and disbelief, for the first gray light of dawn. When the sun finally began to bleed over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and orange, I forced myself to my feet. My legs were stiff, my body ached, but I had to know. With the rifle held at the ready, I unbolted the door and stepped outside. The cold morning air was clean again. The stench of the creatures was gone. The yard was a disaster. The ground was torn to shreds, great gouges ripped in the turf where the fight had happened. There was blood, patches of dark, drying blood on the grass, and a few splatters on the side of the barn. And there were tracks. Dozens of them, churned into the soft earth. The massive, man-like tracks of the three creatures, and among them the familiar, oversized paw prints of Cain. The tracks all led in one direction, away from the house, straight toward the Kettle Moraine forest. I followed the trail, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. The signs of the struggle were clear. Broken branches, more blood, a deep furrow in the earth where a body had been dragged. The trail went about 50 yards into the woods, and then it just stopped. The tracks vanished on a bed of dry pine needles, as if they had all simply ceased to exist. There was no body. There was no sign of Cain. He was gone. They were all gone. For an hour, I just stood there at the edge of the woods, staring into the silent trees, hoping for a sign, a sound, anything. But there was nothing. The woods had taken him back. I eventually walked back to the house, feeling hollowed out, like a scarecrow with its stuffing removed.
I knew I had to call someone, but what could I possibly say? Hello, Sheriff. 3 giant wolfmen attacked my farm, and my pet monster fought them off and they dragged him away. They'd have me in a padded room before lunch. So I did what any sane person in an insane situation would do. I lied. I called the county sheriff's department and reported a possible wolf or feral dog pack attack. I told the dispatcher that a large pack had come onto my property, acting aggressively, and that my dog, a big wolf hybrid, had chased them off into the woods and hadn't come back. I kept my voice steady, matter of fact. I sounded like a concerned farmer, not a man who had just seen his entire reality dismantled. A young deputy came out a few hours later. His name was Evans, a fresh-faced kid who looked like he was barely out of his teens. He was polite and professional. I showed him the torn-up ground, the bloodstains.
He took notes on a little pad, his brow furrowed with sympathy. "Wow, they sure did a number on your yard, Mr. Thorne," he said. "Big ones, you say?" "The biggest I've ever seen," I replied, which was the truest thing I'd said all day. He looked at the snapped barbed wire on the fence, at the deep tracks in the mud. He kicked at a patch of blood-soaked dirt with the toe of his boot. "Probably a transient black bear got into it with your dog," he concluded, clicking his pen. "Or maybe a pack of those coy dogs. They can get pretty bold this time of year. I'll file a report with animal control, let them know to keep an eye out. I hope your dog turns up, sir." He was trying to be helpful. He was operating within the normal, understandable rules of the world. He saw big tracks and blood, and his training gave him a list of possible explanations. Bear, wolf, dog. Monster was not on that list. I just nodded and thanked him for his time. After he left, the silence of the farm settled back in, but it was different now. It was an empty, lonely silence, filled with the ghost of a companion who was no longer there. The aftermath of that night wasn't just a torn-up yard, it was a torn-up life. I don't sleep through the night anymore. Any strange sound from the woods has me up and at the window, rifle in hand. I've installed motion sensor floodlights all around the house and barn. My property is lit up like a prison yard after dark. I don't go into the woods anymore, not even to hunt. That space that was once my backyard, a place of peace, has become a foreign border, the edge of a map that says, "Here be monsters." I find myself thinking about Cain constantly. Was he one of them? An outcast from their tribe, left to die and found by me? Or was he something different? He lived with me for 4 years. He was gentle with my cattle. He would lay his head in my lap by the fire. He showed loyalty and love. But those things that came for him, they were pure malice. They were darkness given form. He was born of them, but he was not like them. He made a choice. In that final moment, he chose me. He chose the human who raised him over his own kind. And I have to live with the knowledge that his loyalty, his sacrifice, probably cost him his life. Did they kill him for his betrayal? Or did they drag him back with them, a prisoner? The not knowing is its own kind of hell. I know why I'm telling this story now. For a year I kept it buried. I was afraid of being called crazy, of the ridicule. I was ashamed, in a way, as if I had failed to protect him. But the silence can't hold. I hear stories now, whispers from other rural places, tales of strange tracks and missing livestock,
of fleeting shapes seen at the edge of the woods. Something is stirring. The world is getting smaller, and the spaces for things like them to hide are shrinking. Maybe they're getting bolder. Or hungrier.
I'm sharing this because people need to stop thinking the world is a safe, predictable place. We live on a thin, well-lit crust of civilization, and just beyond the floodlights, the old, dark things are still there. They haven't gone anywhere. We just forgot how to see them. So if you live out in the country, on the edge of a state park or a national forest, I'm telling you to pay attention. Trust your instincts. If your animals are spooked for no reason, bring them in. If the woods go silent at dusk, lock your doors. Don't go investigating strange sounds in the night. Don't make the same mistake I did. Your curiosity is not worth your life. The image that's burned into my mind, the one that comes to me in the quiet hours before dawn, isn't the sight of those monsters at the tree line. It's the look in Cain's eyes in that last second. That moment of clear, conscious choice. He wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. He understood. He understood the danger. He understood loyalty. And he understood sacrifice. He was more human in that moment than a lot of people I know. I raised a monster, I suppose. Or maybe I raised a hero. I don't know. All I know is that I lost the only family I had left that night. I sit on my porch sometimes, looking out at that dark wall of trees, and I listen. I listen for his melodic moan on the wind. I listen for a sign that he survived, that he's out there somewhere. But mostly, I listen with a cold dread in my heart, terrified that one night I'll hear that deep, booming summons again and know that they've come back.